Quick note before I start: if you enjoy real-life stories about family dynamics, growth, and quiet comebacks, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. It helps more than you know. Okay, here we go. I'm a woman in my early 30s, living in the US, and for as long as I can remember, my mother has believed one thing about me: that I was a disappointment. Not in a dramatic, movie villain way. Worse. In the quiet, constant way that seeps into your bones and teaches you to doubt yourself before anyone else gets the chance. My mom, Linda, loved labels. My brother was the smart one. My cousin was so driven. And I was lost. Too sensitive. Not practical. She never said failure outright when I was young, but she didn't have to. It was in her sighs when teachers praised me. In the way she'd change the subject when relatives asked about my plans. In the half-smile she gave before saying, "She's still figuring things out." We weren't poor. We weren't abusive in ways that leave visible scars. From the outside, we looked normal. But inside our house, approval was currency, and I never had enough. Every choice I made, my major, my jobs, even the people I dated, was treated like further evidence that she was right about me. By the time I moved out, I had internalized her voice as my own. I truly believed that no matter how hard I tried, I'd always fall short. What I didn't know then was that while my mother was busy underestimating me, I was quietly becoming someone she never expected. And that's where this story really begins. Looking back now, it's painfully clear how early my mother started shaping the story she believed about me. Some of my first memories involve standing in the kitchen while she talked about me to someone else, like I wasn't even there. "She's sweet, but she doesn't have much drive," Linda would say, stirring her coffee. Or, "I worry about her future. She's not like other kids." I was 8 years old. At school, I actually did well. I loved reading, writing, anything creative. Teachers told my mom I was thoughtful and observant. She'd smile politely, then tell me on the drive home that creativity didn't pay bills. "You need to be realistic," she'd say. "You don't want to end up struggling." Somehow, her concern always sounded like disappointment. Whenever I failed at something small, a bad grade, quitting a sport, changing my mind, she treated it like confirmation. She kept mental receipts. Years later she'd bring them up. "Remember when you couldn't even finish piano lessons, or you've always had trouble sticking with things?" It didn't matter that I was a child when those things happened. In her eyes, I had already shown my limits. What hurt most wasn't the criticism itself, but the lack of protection. When relatives made jokes at family dinners, "So, what are you doing with your life now?" she never shut them down. Sometimes she joined in. I learned early that I was on my own emotionally, even inside my own family. By my teens, I stopped arguing. I stopped defending myself. It was easier to agree, to shrink, to become what she already thought I was. I didn't realize then how much damage that quiet surrender was doing, or how long it would take to undo. If my mother needed proof that I was the problem, she always had a comparison ready. My older brother, Mark, was her favorite example. He was organized, confident, and loud about his achievements. Even when he failed, she framed it as experience. When I struggled, it was a character flaw. Mark and I grew up in the same house, with the same resources, but we lived in completely different emotional worlds. When he brought home a B, my mom said, "That's okay, I know you can do better." When I brought home the same grade, she asked what went wrong. If he changed majors, it was because he was exploring his options. When I did, it was because I was indecisive. Family gatherings made the contrast even sharper. Linda would proudly list Mark's internships, his plans, his potential. When someone turned to me, she'd answer for me before I could speak. "She's still trying to figure herself out," she'd say with a laugh that wasn't kind. It trained everyone else to see me through her lens. You. What made it worse was that Mark didn't have to compete. He absorbed the praise like it was his birthright. Sometimes he'd even repeat our mother's words back to me, half joking, half serious. "You just need to work harder," he'd say. "Not everyone's cut out for success, I started believing that love in our family was conditional. You earned it by performing well, by fitting the role assigned to you. And mine was clear, the cautionary tale. The one my mother used to motivate everyone else. It took years to understand that this dynamic wasn't accidental. It was comfortable for her. As long as someone else was the disappointment, she never had to question her own behavior, or her need to feel superior. One of the hardest things about my relationship with my mother was that her cruelty wasn't always private. Some of her favorite moments came when there was an audience. It was subtle enough that she could deny it later, but sharp enough that I felt it every time. I remember a family barbecue when I was in my early 20s. I had just started a new job, nothing glamorous, but something I was proud of. An aunt asked how it was going, and before I could answer, my mom laughed and said, "Well, it's temporary. She's still trying to find her place." Everyone smiled awkwardly. Someone changed the subject. I stood there, cheeks burning, holding a plastic cup and wishing I could disappear. At weddings, holidays, even church events, she'd find ways to undercut me. "Don't get your hopes up," she once said loudly when someone asked if I planned to go back to school. Another time, she joked that I was all potential, no follow-through. People laughed, assuming it was harmless teasing. I learned how easy it was for humiliation to hide behind humor. What hurt most was that if I ever confronted her later, she'd act offended. "You're too sensitive," she'd say. I was just being honest. "You need to toughen up." Somehow, my pain became proof of my weakness, not her behavior. After a while, I stopped sharing things with her altogether. No goals, no dreams, no struggles. I learned that anything personal could be turned into a punchline. I smiled when expected, stayed quiet when possible, and carried my shame home with me. Those moments chipped away at me slowly, but consistently. Each public dismissal reinforced the same message: I wasn't worth taking seriously. And I believed it, until life forced me to see myself without her voice narrating every step. By my mid-20s, the voice in my head sounded exactly like my mother's. Every setback felt permanent. Every mistake felt like proof that she had been right all along. When friends talked about promotions, grad school, or buying homes, I smiled and nodded while feeling completely left behind. I bounced between jobs I didn't love, not because I was incapable, but because I was terrified of aiming too high. Every time I considered applying for something better, I could already hear Linda's response: "That's not realistic." So I stayed small. Safe. Invisible. The lowest point came after I lost a job during a round of layoffs. It wasn't personal, half the department was cut, but that didn't matter to me. I drove home in silence, sat on my apartment floor, and cried until I couldn't breathe. I didn't call my mom. I already knew what she'd say. Something about how unstable my path had always been. Something about how I needed to get it together. For weeks, I barely left my apartment. I avoided social media, family gatherings, anything that reminded me of how far behind I felt. I genuinely believed I was broken in some fundamental way. Not unlucky. Not confused. Just lesser. And yet, in that quiet misery, something unexpected happened. For the first time, my mother wasn't there to comment. No sighs. No comparisons. No reminders of who she thought I was. It was just me, alone with my thoughts. That silence was terrifying, but it was also the first space I'd ever had to ask myself a dangerous question: what if she was wrong about me? The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic speech, no overnight transformation. It started with something small and almost embarrassing: relief. Relief that I didn't have to report my failure to anyone. Relief that no one was watching, judging, or narrating my life from the sidelines. One night, sitting on my couch in the dark, I realized how much of my energy had been spent trying to prove my mother wrong, and how little had been spent figuring out who I actually was. For the first time, I wasn't asking, what would make her proud? I was asking, what do I want, even if no one ever applauds it? I started setting tiny goals. Not the kind you post about. The kind you keep to yourself. I updated my resume. I took free online courses late at night. I read books about people who had started over later than I had. No one knew. That was the point. I also stopped calling my mom for advice. At first, it felt like betrayal. Then it felt like peace. Without her constant commentary, my thoughts became clearer. I noticed that I wasn't lazy. I wasn't incapable. I was scared, and for good reason. There was a strange power in moving quietly. No expectations meant no pressure to perform. I could fail privately, learn privately, and grow without someone immediately labeling the outcome. That's when I made a promise to myself, even though I didn't say it out loud, I would build a life that didn't require my mother's approval. If she never noticed, fine. If she never understood, also fine. I didn't know it yet, but this quiet decision would eventually shake the very narrative she'd spent decades building about me. The next few years of my life happened almost entirely off my mother's radar. I took a job that paid less than I wanted but taught me skills I knew would matter later. I stayed late. I asked questions. I made mistakes and fixed them without announcing any of it to my family. At night, I studied. Sometimes I was exhausted, sometimes I doubted myself, but I kept going because no one was there to tell me it was pointless. I started saving money for the first time in my life. Not a lot, but enough to feel like I was finally moving forward instead of treading water. When my mom asked how I was doing, I kept my answers vague. Fine, I'd say. Busy. She took that as confirmation that nothing had changed. She still offered unsolicited advice, still hinted that I should consider something more stable. I let her believe it. Correcting her no longer felt necessary. Slowly, things started to click. I got better opportunities. I met mentors who saw potential instead of problems. For the first time, people listened when I spoke. They trusted me. They valued my work. It felt unreal, like I had been living in the wrong story my entire life. There were moments I wanted to tell her. Moments I imagined her surprise, her approval. But something in me hesitated. I wasn't building this life for her reaction. I was building it for myself. So I stayed quiet. I let her keep believing I was still lost, and in that silence, I became stronger than I ever thought I could be. As my life slowly stabilized, the distance between my mother and me became less accidental and more intentional. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront her. I simply stopped offering access to the parts of me she had never treated with care. I visited less. I called less. When I did see her, I kept conversations surface level. Work was fine. Life was busy. She noticed, of course. She always did. At one point she asked, half joking, "You don't need your mother anymore?" There was a sharpness under the smile. Setting boundaries felt unnatural at first. I had been trained to explain myself, to justify my choices, to soften everything so she wouldn't feel challenged. Now, I let silence do the work. If she criticized, I didn't argue. If she dismissed something, I didn't defend it. I just disengaged. What surprised me was how uncomfortable that made her. Without my reactions, her comments hung in the air. Without my need for approval, she lost leverage. She started fishing for information through other relatives, asking if anyone knew what I was up to. I heard about it secondhand and felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The more space I created, the clearer I became. I wasn't angry all the time anymore. I slept better. I trusted my own judgment. I was becoming someone my younger self would have admired, not because of success, but because of self-respect. I didn't realize then that this distance was setting the stage for the moment everything would finally come into the open. Even with the distance, my mother never truly let go of the version of me she'd created in her head. Whenever we did interact, she found subtle ways to remind me who she thought I was. Still at that same job, she'd ask, her tone light but loaded. Or, it's okay if you don't have big ambitions. Not everyone does. What struck me was how little curiosity she had. She never asked what I actually did, what my days looked like, or whether I was happy. She didn't want to know. Curiosity might have challenged her narrative, and that narrative had become part of her identity. At a family dinner, she praised my brother for a promotion he'd gotten months earlier. Then she turned to me and said, "You'll find your place eventually." It was said kindly, almost warmly, but it still landed like a verdict. I smiled and nodded, feeling oddly detached. The difference now was that her words no longer defined me. They still hurt, but they didn't hollow me out. Instead, they clarified something important. No amount of achievement would ever be enough for her if it meant admitting she'd been wrong. I realized then that my mother's contempt wasn't about my choices. It was about control. As long as she could see me as lesser, she never had to reflect on her own behavior, or apologize for the years of damage. That understanding didn't bring closure, but it brought clarity, and clarity prepared me for the moment when the truth about my life would no longer be avoidable, whether she was ready for it or not. The reveal wasn't something I planned. In fact, I had gone out of my way to avoid it. But life has a way of pulling the curtain back when you least expect it. It started when my company was mentioned in a local business article. Nothing flashy, just a profile about a growing firm and a quote from me as part of the leadership team. I didn't share it. I didn't post it anywhere. I assumed it would disappear into the internet like everything else. I was wrong. A few days later, my phone lit up with messages from relatives I barely spoke to anymore. "Is this you? Why didn't you tell us? We're so proud of you." The word proud felt strange, almost intrusive. Then my mother called. Her voice was different. Lighter. Careful. She asked casual questions that weren't casual at all. "So, what exactly do you do now?" she said. I could hear pages turning in her head as she tried to reconcile this new information with the old story she'd told herself for years. I answered honestly, but briefly. No gloating. No defensiveness. Just facts. There was a pause. Too long. Then she laughed and said, "Well, I always knew you'd figure something out." Something out. That was the moment I realized the truth was no longer hidden, and that she would do anything to reshape it in a way that didn't threaten her version of the past. The real moment of discovery didn't come from that article. That was just the crack in the wall. What followed was my mother doing what she always did when she sensed she was losing control, digging for information she thought she deserved. A few weeks later, I showed up to a family gathering I almost skipped. The room felt different the second I walked in. Conversations paused. People looked at me longer than usual. My aunt hugged me too tightly and whispered, "We had no idea." That's when I knew my life had become a topic of discussion without my consent. My mother pulled me aside into the kitchen. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was fascinated. Almost suspicious. She asked direct questions now: salary, title, how long this had been going on. When I answered calmly, I saw something flicker across her face. Not pride. Not happiness. Fear. Because in that moment, she wasn't discovering my success. She was discovering how wrong she had been for years. And that realization clearly terrified her. She tried to regain footing quickly. She reminded me of sacrifices she'd made. Mentioned how hard she'd been on me because she'd believed in my potential. The story was rewriting itself in real time, and I was watching it happen. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to correct her, or accept the revision. I just listened. And that's when it hit me, she wasn't shocked that I had become someone, she was shocked that I had done it without her. After that gathering, everything shifted. My mother started calling more often, but the tone was unfamiliar. She sounded proud, almost performative about it. She told relatives how driven I had always been, how she knew I'd succeed eventually. Hearing her say those words felt surreal, like listening to someone read from a script written for a different family. At the same time, she began crossing boundaries she'd ignored for years. She asked for advice. She hinted that I could help her with certain expenses. Once, she even joked that she could finally brag about me properly. The pride she displayed wasn't rooted in connection. It was ownership. When I gently pushed back, she grew defensive. "Why are you acting so distant?" she asked. "I'm your mother. I've always supported you." The denial was absolute. Any mention of the past was brushed off or reframed as motivation. According to her, the criticism, the comparisons, the humiliation, none of it had really happened. That was when I understood something crucial: my success didn't heal our relationship. It exposed it. She wasn't interested in accountability or understanding the damage she'd caused. She wanted access to the version of me that made her look good. When I didn't immediately give it to her, her warmth cooled. The compliments became conditional. The old guilt crept back in. Only this time, I saw it clearly. And for the first time, I wasn't willing to sacrifice my peace just to maintain her illusion. The real shift happened quietly, in a way no one else seemed to notice at first. My mother was still talking at me, still rewriting history, still trying to position herself as the guiding force behind my life, but the difference was that I no longer needed her to see me a certain way. I started responding differently. When she bragged about me to relatives, I didn't glow with gratitude. When she hinted that I owed her for raising me, I didn't rush to reassure her. I stayed calm. Neutral. Polite. And that unnerved her more than any argument ever could. One afternoon, during a phone call, she said, "You know, if it weren't for how hard I was on you, you wouldn't be where you are now." There was a pause, clearly waiting for agreement. For the old version of me to apologize, to soften it, to give her credit. Instead, I said, "I succeeded despite a lot of that, not because of it." Silence. She laughed it off, but the laughter was thin. From that point on, the balance of power changed. She began choosing her words more carefully. She asked instead of assumed. And when she pushed too far and I ended a conversation, she didn't chase me like she used to. For the first time, I was the one setting the tone. I wasn't trying to prove my worth anymore. I already knew it, and watching her adjust to that reality was strangely validating, not because she finally respected me, but because I no longer needed her to. I used to think closure meant an apology. That one day my mother would sit across from me, look me in the eye, and admit that she'd been wrong, that her words had hurt me, that her comparisons had shaped my self-doubt, that she had underestimated me in ways that mattered. For a long time, I waited for that moment. It never came. What did come instead was something quieter, and honestly, more powerful. I stopped needing her to validate my pain in order for it to be real. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, imagining better outcomes. I accepted that she might never take responsibility, and that her limitations didn't have to define the rest of my life. I set firmer boundaries. When conversations turned dismissive or self-serving, I ended them. When she tried to take credit for my achievements, I didn't argue, I simply changed the subject or excused myself. I no longer felt obligated to explain my choices or justify my distance. Strangely enough, that's when the anger began to fade. Not because what she did was okay, but because I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. I had built a life filled with people who saw me clearly, who respected me without needing to feel superior. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I realized then that healing wasn't about winning her approval. It was about choosing myself, over and over again, even when it felt uncomfortable. Especially then. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that you don't need someone's permission to become who you are. Especially when that someone benefits from you staying small. For years, I believed my mother's voice because it was the loudest one in my life. I confused familiarity with truth. Letting go of that belief was painful, but it was also the moment I finally became free. I don't hate my mother. I understand her better now. I see how her need for control, her fear of being wrong, and her own unresolved insecurities shaped the way she treated me. But understanding doesn't mean excusing, and it doesn't mean sacrificing myself to keep the peace. Today, my life is full in ways I once thought were impossible. Not because I proved her wrong, but because I stopped trying to prove anything at all. My worth isn't measured by her approval, my achievements don't exist to redeem my past, and my future belongs to me. If you're reading this and you grew up being told, directly or indirectly, that you weren't enough, please hear this: that story was never yours to carry. You are allowed to grow quietly. You are allowed to succeed without witnesses. And you are allowed to set boundaries with people who only love you when you're convenient to them. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't being seen. It's becoming whole, without them.